Thank you for joining us today at this event kindly hosted by KPMG for the McKell Institute, where we'll be hearing from Nick Greiner about the Infrastructure New South Wales strategy. As you're all aware, a week ago, Mr Greiner and Infrastructure New South Wales released the New South Wales Infrastructure Strategy. This report is a first of its kind. Not only did it comprehensively chart the infrastructure challenges that New South Wales faces, but it also provided solutions and recommendations. And already the O'Farrell government has committed to the West Connect project and considering other recommendations and projects that are within the Infrastructure New South Wales strategy. Now, I know you all have well-thumbed copies of the infrastructure strategy and are waiting to ask questions. And we're very excited to be able to hear from Mr Greiner today to further outline his vision for New South Wales when it comes to infrastructure. I'd like to acknowledge and thank KPMG, who are both our sponsors and our hosts today in this magnificent venue. We can see Sydney's infrastructure revealing itself before our very eyes at the Barangaroo site. As I'm sure you're well aware, KPMG are one of the world's leading professional services firms. They have over 140,000 member firms and are active in over 150 countries. And I'd like to, in particular, thank and acknowledge Graham Brook, who's the partner in charge of KPMG's Corporate Finances, Infrastructure and Projects Group, and also their Real Estate Advisory Services Group. Graham is an infrastructure specialist with over 20 years' experience working in Australia, the UK, South Africa and Asia. So I couldn't think of anyone more appropriate to welcome us and introduce Nick Greiner today. Please join me in inviting Graham Brook.
All right, thank you for that, Peter. On behalf of KPMG, I would like to welcome the Honourable Nick Greiner, the McKell Institute, of course, members and guests to this luncheon here today, where we want to discuss the importance of the state's infrastructure as an economic driver. The McKell Institute plays a key role in influencing public debate and already has grown a reputation for developing practical policy ideas through debate, study and policy papers. The McKell Institute is at the forefront of debate regarding Sydney's infrastructure needs and the link to productivity, so congratulations. Sydney produces 20% of the nation's wealth and 2/3 of that of New South Wales. So what happens in Sydney and with Sydney's infrastructure, or doesn't happen, is of critical importance to the nation. The Institute fully recognises the importance of infrastructure in securing productivity, competitiveness and social well-being, and we applaud the Institute for taking the initiative in organising today's event. Now, the New South Wales Government, Nick and Infrastructure New South Wales have already made tremendous progress in relation to delivering much needed infrastructure in the state. So notable projects do include the North West Rail Link, the Sydney Convention Centre, the M5 widening, the refinancing of the Sydney diesel plant, and our very good but very noisy neighbour, the Barangaroo redevelopment project. And KPMG has been privileged to work on a number of these projects. The state infrastructure strategy produced by Nick and Infrastructure New South Wales represents for us a new standard in Australia for infrastructure planning and delivery. And we congratulate Nick, Paul Broad and the wider team on producing such a comprehensive and well-researched and considered body of work. So again, congratulations. Now, in the room today, we have just over 100 people with a key interest in infrastructure. Now, what that means is that we have 100 people in the room with different views about the infrastructure priorities in Sydney and New South Wales. So just to help to consolidate those views, I guess one option is we should curtail debate of anything with the word second in it. So the second Sydney Airport, the second harbour crossing, I guess if we rule out anything with the word second, we'd make considerable progress today. But I know, knowing Nick, we will not be avoiding those difficult subjects. So, without further delay, I would like to invite the very Honourable Nick Greiner, the Chairman of Infrastructure New South Wales, to present his vision for infrastructure in New South Wales. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Graham, John Watkins, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here. I was delighted when John invited me. This is my first appearance at the McKell Institute, maybe my last after these remarks. But I actually think, and I have been a number of times to the Whitlam Institute to talk about non-infrastructure subjects, I think the quality of public debate in Australia is pathetic. And one of the reasons it's pathetic is that it seems impossible to have public debate except in the prism of partisan party politics. And that essentially means that you don't have a debate, as is evidenced at the federal level in all sorts of areas at the moment. So thank you for the invitation to be here. This is, I think, my only public speech, and frankly I chose the venue, or I accepted the invitation with malice aforethought. Infrastructure New South Wales is not out there arguing its corner. We're not arguing, we're not out there wanting to run a campaign that says our particular view of priorities is better than other people's view. That's not our task. We've made our document public. We've obviously given it to the government. The government will have a process, probably won't much involve us, maybe a little in terms of considering what other people, other departments think about what we've said, and the government will come up with a considered view. And as I'm fond of saying, frankly, what the report says is almost irrelevant, except in as much as it leads to something happening. I mean, it's nice to have another report, and thank you for the kind words about it. It was mostly the staff, not me, I have to say, who did it. But it has been, by and large, well received because it has a clear point of view, and it comes with a clear set of economic assumptions, and we're unashamed about the fact that we're prioritising things on a productivity sort of basis rather than on some other wish list, political, who's most in favour of it, and so on. So I've deliberately made this the only, I think, public speech I'm making in this time period, because one of the really good things about Mr. O'Farrell's idea, which I had nothing to do with in its conception, is to try and get beyond the electoral cycle. It is perfectly obvious that if you've got infrastructure projects that are 10 and 20 years into the future, and this is a 20-year document, you don't need me to make a smart-ass comment about when Labor will be in power in New South Wales. I could make some of those, but I won't. But it's obvious that in the 20-year time frame, there's changes of politics. So, of course, trying to get beyond the electoral cycle is a good idea. And I noticed when I read up about Mr. McKell, whom I confess I wasn't and am not an expert on, but one of the things that stuck out in what Peter sent me is a line about he had a distaste for divisiveness. And I think that's very appropriate in a lot of policy areas. Used to be appropriate in immigration federally. It was a much better debate when there wasn't a divisive nature about it. So infrastructure, I think, obviously, and for reasons that everyone can see, lends itself to being, as far as possible, above politics. So my sense of this, I'll give you a short illustration. When I became opposition leader in 1983, I was interviewed by John Laws, and he said, well, what are you going to do that's different to all the previous 9 opposition leaders who've been there in the last 9 years? And I didn't really know the answer, But one of the answers I gave him was that I was going to set out to agree with the government, to agree with Neville Wran. And I did do that. I set out to find opportunities, actually went out of my way to find opportunities. I would actually call up radio stations to say, oh, Rand's just said X, and I think that's really terrific. And I'm sure Mr Robertson doesn't want advice from me, but frankly, the best thing opposition leaders coming in the sort of context in which Labor's in New South Wales, if you're trying to rebuild some respect and some credibility and all those things, which clearly Labor's lost in New South Wales, you ought to try and find issues, obviously not every issue, but issues that lend themselves to a public interest viewpoint. So I think that is the appropriate way to go. And if I might say in passing, I happened to hear John Watkins on the radio with Kerry Chikarovsky, and I missed the start. So I recognised Kerry's voice, and I didn't know who was making all these intelligent and balanced comments a couple of days ago, but it turned out to be John. So, I mean, I'm going to rabbit on about that, but it is sort of obvious. I think the public's sick of the way the debates go, and the notion that you go back to the last federal election where, I think Julia had railway lines in Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. They were mostly ones that the state governments had never thought about or didn't like or whatever. And that's going to probably happen again at the next federal election on both sides. This is not a partisan thing. It's really pathetic. I mean, I think the public want things to happen. They recognise that they take a long time because it's obvious that they do. And this is one of them, I think, many areas where the body politic would do really well if it grew up and argued on merits, argued on long-term objectives and plans rather than on, oh, well, we don't really believe these guys, they haven't got any money, or when's it going to happen? The sort of standard response you get from any sort of opposition leader, typically. The only other contextual things I want to say are that when I walked into the press conference to launch Infrastructure New South Wales last Wednesday, I think it was 20 to 11. And here we are with this 20-year strategy. And all I heard about for the first 5 minutes were various members of the media worrying about what they could get on the 11 o'clock news, which was 20 minutes away. And I did say to one of them, it actually reflects in a trivial way, it reflects the problem that the news cycle, perfectly understandably, people are worried about saying something or getting something on the 11 o'clock news. And here are these poor bozos, Broad and I, trying to talk about 20 years. And that sort of dichotomy is a problem, and I don't think there's an easy answer to that. It's not a right and wrong thing. It's just a reality of modern media and modern coverage. And the other thing I'd say is the question I really liked, and I forget who it was from, very early on was, how many houses are going to be pulled down in Parramatta Road? And I mean, unfortunately, that's also part of I suppose the normal media response to find who might be the losers in this thing rather than what is the benefits for the community as a whole. So my sort of theme really is that there are some issues that do repay consensus, and infrastructure is certainly one. Which is not incidentally to say that I think I don't personally think everything in our report's spot on or right or going to happen. It's a document that's compiled and had a board of both public and private sector people. It'd be highly unlikely that all of those had the same views, or indeed that all the people who did the work have identical views. But broadly, I think this is an issue in New South Wales where we have done worse than every other state by a very long way. Ignore Tasmania. We've done worse than every other state in this space, and it's been true for a fair while, and we ought to change. I went recently to the Infrastructure Partnerships Australia Summit in Melbourne. What struck me was I listened to 6 or 7 different speakers. Rod Eddington, who's the federal government's equivalent of me, I suppose. There was Scott Charlton from Transurban. There was Terry Moran, who used to be head of the Prime Minister's Department. Kerry Schott, who'd done a report here and worked for both governments. There was a real cross-section of what you might reasonably say were experts or people who knew a fair bit about government and infrastructure. And I said in this little panel I was on, the thing that strikes you is there isn't much disagreement at a technical level. at an expert level. There really isn't. You have to search for disagreement amongst the experts, if you allow me to use that word. I suspect the reality is that the politicians and the politics are running behind public opinion. I'll come to some issues where I think that's the case. So I think it is a matter of finding, not of more and more meetings and expert, infrastructure events. I don't think you need those. You actually need to work out how you bring the public, and I think more so the politicians, along with where the public and reality obviously is. There is, for example, very significant agreement between Infrastructure Australia and Infrastructure New South Wales. We have sort of a common approach, common economic assumptions by and large. We don't agree precisely with every route of every rail line. But again, I guess I'm just trying to make the point that clearly a Labor government initiative, and a good one, of Kevin Rudd's, and led by Mike Deegan, who's clearly a Labor Party associated person, and New South Wales, you've got Paul Broad, who's clearly much more private sector, Liberal Party, if you like, associated person. Yet the actual views are overwhelmingly similar. And I just think it's time we all got to that understanding. It's not very hard. And then worked out, you can fight about particular things, or why did it take so long to build this, or why hasn't it happened? There's always things to fight about for the politicians. But at least if one got agreement on the broad body of substance and strategy in a longer term sense, we'd all be a hell of a lot better off. For example, the time frames, the North West Rail Line and WestConnex, all things being equal, are going to exist in around 2020, 21, 22. And I can work out that's heading for a decade from now. And that's assuming everything goes well, which in these large projects isn't always the case. Now, if you just take the reality of that, the fact that for the next, between now and about 2 or 3 elections from now, these projects are happening. Rail line's happening. WestConnex has got a floor of people over in North Sydney working on it now. It'll probably start well before the next election. You've got to get past the notion of, we've got to find a way of stopping it or something. Which incidentally I used to say in opposition as an opposition leader. I talked the same rubbish. I think I said something about the Harbour Tunnel, where we did have some, I have to say, Tony Shepherd knows, I think there was some legitimate process questions about Mr Keating and the tax office and whatever. But, it is the way politics has traditionally been played. Labor builds a harbour or mandates a harbour crossing and a monorail, and the opposition leader, whoever he is, says, just elect us and we'll stop it. They usually know that's totally impossible, as I certainly did on both those cases, and it's just part of the typical political debate, which has caused the lack of trust that I think the public has in the infrastructure process in Australia, but most particularly in New South Wales. I think that applies to funding. I heard Mr Robertson say, they don't know how they're going to pay for this WestConnex. Okay, fair enough response in 7 seconds. But we all know the answers. It isn't going to come from borrowing, regardless of who's in office, not in any significant way. It's not going to come from surpluses in any significant way. So if you rule those out, which are the normal ways you fund things, you're really left with user charges and asset recycling, taking existing brownfield assets, selling them and investing in that same net proceeds into greenfield. And it's not about ideology. People think, that I'm sort of a rabid Thatcherite or something about privatisation. You just start with the outcome. And the outcome is there won't be significant increases in infrastructure in New South Wales without user charges and asset sales. And that's 100% inevitable, not 95, 100% inevitable. So it'd be a lot better if everyone got over it. As I say, there are lots of things to argue about. Don't argue about that. And I think the same applies a bit to the modal split, road versus rail. I think on the day, the first person to come out and say that our report was a piece of excrescence or whatever was some Greens spokesman. I think state doesn't matter. Some Greens spokesman said, "Oh, it's all terrible. There should be a lot more trains, and all this rubbish about cars is just ridiculous." Look, you can see the facts about modality. We weren't about anti-rail or pro-car or pro-road or pro-bus, although we probably are a bit pro-bus. We think buses get a bit of a bum rap as an effective means of public transport. People think of public transport as trains, when clearly buses take exactly as many people into the city each day as trains. So, one needs to be a bit fair dinkum about that too. But I guess all I'm saying is that our report took the realities that the government's about to spend, and I did use the expression as much as the cost of a snowy scheme, and people immediately took that as a criticism of the government. It wasn't. I was trying to make the point that there is huge investment going into heavy rail. South West Rail Line, which started in John's government's time, and North West Rail. There is huge investment in heavy rail, much more than has happened in sort of living memory. So you've got to take that, along with our recommendations on motorways and things. You've got to take the whole picture rather than ignoring the fact that there's 10 or 12 billion about to be spent on heavy rail and then say, oh, we should have more rail projects. Incidentally, in passing, there weren't any. Our job was not to create projects, our job was to review projects. There actually aren't any rail projects of size and significance that were there to be reviewed. Passenger rail, there's a lot of freight projects which we've recommended. So I think the same applies a bit. It's too easy to get into try and get, and I suppose sort of natural, Labor's going to support public transport or Action for Public Transport as a lobby group. It's sort of an easy free kick, and yeah, sure, most of the people in Action for Public Transport probably come a bit from that side of the political spectrum. Yeah, good. And maybe the NRMA's by and large a little more centre-right. But from a government point of view and a public point of view, you don't, it's fine. You've got people writing rubbish in the papers about, oh, these guys hate rail or they're in love with cars. That's just nonsense. The truth is, you do have to look after the roads, both for car and bus transport, and there is not an alternative. There is not an alternative. So again, I think getting the debate past the sort of, we're for trains and they're for cars, and never the twain shall meet. That isn't what the report says, and you sort of wonder who actually reads these reports. I suspect most people read the summaries in the press table down the back, but not the actual report. So I think that's enough. You get the point. Let me say a bit about issues that where I think there is room for this sort of debate. Western Sydney, I said publicly, no one amazingly picked it up, that I was asked at, I think the Cedar lunch, what did I think were some of the weak areas? I think some of the weak areas are there aren't enough good ideas about Western Sydney. Again, as I say, we're not supposed to make them up. We're supposed to receive the ideas. Problem is most of the ideas out there come from councils, so they're broken up into local things rather than more systemic. But I think Western Sydney, which is now also, I suppose, a political battleground, which it hasn't been historically, there is a real need for sensible debate about the projects in years 10 through 20, if you like, of our 20-year time frame in Western Sydney, and there ought to be a proper debate at Wesrock and all these places, and Liberal and Labor parties who are fiercely contesting Western Sydney these days ought to be part of that debate. I suppose that does bring me automatically to the airport, which Graham suggested I wouldn't avoid. I actually think the politicians on both sides are running way behind the community. I noticed Alan Joyce said yesterday that of course there needs to be a supplementary airport 20 or 30 years out. Paul Keating has said it, and it's not a political thing. You're not going to have a city of 6 million people in the time frame beyond this report, which has only one airport stuck at one edge. And if I was worried about, as I broadly am, about Western Sydney, about the city, the greater Parramatta city, if I was really worried about jobs, because everyone talks, oh, we should bring jobs out there rather than all these people having to come in here every day. What a good idea. Where are those jobs going to come from? It's a struggle. They're not all going to work in logistics centres around the M7. Some do. But one of the ways of getting serious jobs growth is Badgerys Creek, and we are talking 20, 30 years out in practice. So I think it's a pity there that both sides, I mean, there's a unity ticket. The unity ticket is nobody wants to talk about it. I sort of follow aircraft noise is an issue on which people can get excited. They fly over my house at Centennial Park, and I get very upset on the weekends when it spoils my morning coffee. But I think the second airport, if we're serious about Western Sydney and its future and the employment future, the government, and it's both, I think Laurie Brereton started buying this land back in the early 90s, the case needs to be made for why the average person, I know there's no average people, the average person in Western Sydney, I think rationally ought to be overwhelmingly in favour of an airport at Badgerys Creek. There's no doubt in my mind, and I actually don't know that I've heard from anyone on either side of politics, state or federal, a rational argument. The only rational argument was from the guy who runs Canberra Airport. He might have a little self-interest, and he's a strong supporter of the Premier's view. Okay, I mean, everyone's allowed to have their self-interested point of view. So I think the airport is another issue, and these are difficult issues around the world. Second airports of supplementary runways happening at Heathrow at the moment. But it is an issue where we could afford to have a fair income discussion about what is really the impact, what land is already owned. Yeah, when I think it was the Herald, they normally go and find people who are disadvantaged. I think they found, if it's not the Herald, I apologise, some newspaper found someone who was running a horse and buggy business that was a wedding, used to take people to weddings in horse and carriage. And they're out in Badgerys Creek, and they said, oh, if there's an airport, we'd probably have to move. And I figured, whoa, that sounds like a serious problem. I do think the public opinion is ahead of the politicians, state and federal, on this. Not expecting them all to come out tomorrow or in front of a federal election with a different view to what they've expressed, but I think it's important for people in this room, and it doesn't matter which part of the sort of political spectrum you come from. You know, your grandchildren, especially if you're from Western Sydney, want and need an airport in Western Sydney, and it's, I think, beyond reasonable doubt. I think that's probably enough on that. Just in terms of urban renewal, which I suspect will be similarly, it's a subject that lends itself to NIMBYs and council opposition and so on. I think the government has yet to release its metropolitan plan, and I don't know what's in it, although I've got sort of general idea. But the metropolitan plan, or any plan, cannot say that Sydney is going to continue to grow predominantly at its fringes. Again, that's not like an ideological position or anything else. It is simply what the market's doing. As I say, the politicians are behind the market. The market at the moment, I think the real number is like 80 or 85% of new houses are in the brownfield, to use the jargon. And that's not going to change. For what it's worth, I think the government, the Farrell government's doing a really good job on greenfield, making land available, mostly obviously on the fringes. Doesn't matter how good a job they do. The truth is, when Sydney's 6 million, most of them are going to live in the existing urban area. So I think we need to have, in the Grattan Institute, I mean, again, this I think goes well beyond ideological things. You've got to have a community debate about how, in a good quality way, and it's a good issue for the McKell Institute as well as others, it shouldn't be the prerogative of the property council or the urban task force. I mean, this is actually about how we live as a city. And it doesn't matter what I think or you think, we're going to live with more people in the existing metropolitan area, lots more. And we've got ideas in there about Parramatta Road. and I won't repeat my line that it looks like Beirut on a bad Friday night and why don't people do something. I was actually approached in the street yesterday by someone who said that 50 years ago they moved into Gipp Street. Someone will know where Gipp Street is, apparently 1 block over from Parramatta Road. And this person said, when we moved in, they said to us, our neighbours said, don't invest too much money because the government's about to have an urban renewal project on both sides of Parramatta Road. It really can't go on the way it is. And she said they recently sold the family home like 48 years later, and absolutely nothing had changed in Parramatta Road. And we also have, I think, some interesting ideas about southeastern Sydney. If you take the area broadly from Randwick down to La Perouse, it is inevitable that the area that's being developed, sort of Green Park and all that, will spread that way. That is an area that's close to beaches, got all the obvious positives. It's easy to provide public transport, much easier than some parts of Western Sydney. So, we've said it's further out. We've said further out in time terms. We do think that southeastern Sydney is an area that Urban Growth New South Wales, which is this new organisation that's sort of about to start, really ought to have a look at. Because again, we are so far behind Victoria in particular. I mean, Victoria's had Vic Urban and they've done by and large a really good job. And again, it crosses the Bracks and Kennett government and so on. It isn't the province of one or other party. We've never really had that debate about where people live and how we develop higher density living in areas that have got existing infrastructure or are close to existing infrastructure. And that applies also, of course, to Wollongong and Newcastle. Most of you are not that interested in that, but Wollongong and Newcastle CBDs are both examples of urban market failure, and they're both important to New South Wales. And if you want something to happen, it's an appropriate place for governments to help or to intervene, but there needs to be renewal, and that means people, amazingly, renewal of both Newcastle and Wollongong CBDs. And look, just finally, Graham, I've probably gone beyond my time. I think one of the issues that everyone ought to focus on, and I'm sure the government is the CBD. It's actually the hardest issue. The truth is, the CBD, we all know the story, there were oxen coming up from the wharf 200 years ago, and so roads mostly go higgledy-piggledy. It's not nice and straight and square or rectangular. I think the future congestion or decongestion, I occasionally use the word constipation and my advisors say you can't use that word. Okay, I'm using it anyway. The city runs a real serious risk of being constipated at various times, and this area down here will run a real serious risk as part of that. So, again, I think this is an area, and we've got an idea, and I'm not sure, and we say in the report, we're not sure whether the underground buses work in practice, but it certainly deserves investigation. There are other ideas for turning the buses around at the northern and southern ends of the city. I think the important thing is we all recognise that having a CBD which does not function, does not move people, is not an acceptable option. And people were saying, I won't dob them in at the table, issues like light rail develop sort of a life of their own, sort of sexy to have light rail. And it is quite sexy. The question is that important as a primary objective? What we've said is we think the first objective ought to be to build light rail out to the university, sort of University of New South Wales, from Central. And, if in time you sort out the city, especially the east-west parts of the city, which don't work, partly because the cross-city tunnel doesn't work, partly because John's government walked away from the project effectively. Not John's government, the government in which he was in. But the cross-city tunnel doesn't achieve the purpose it was meant to achieve. Forget for a minute why. So there are real serious issues about getting people and cars and buses and trucks to move around the city. And so you can't start with an amenity argument, an argument that says, oh, it'd be nice to have a pedestrian mall in George Street. Yeah, we think it is nice too. We say so. But it's not a priority. It's an outcome of a really difficult planning question about how you get this particular city with its particular configuration and its numbers of cars and whatever, how you get it to work better. So Graham, that's enough from me. Sorry if I've gone a little long. I'm happy later on to answer any questions, and thanks again, John, for the invitation.